So welcome everyone to our webinar today about open access. My name is Lauren Hertel. I'm the Communications Manager for the Robert and Patricia Switzer Foundation. Meredith is one of our fellows. She's a 2013 Switzer Fellow who is currently doing a postdoc as a postdoc fellow at Harvard University's Sustainability Science program. Meredith has worked for years on open access advocacy and publishing issues, so we are very excited to have her with us today to sort of give you the latest and greatest on open access and also give all of us some ideas on how we can help her advocate for more open access. She has a number of achievements in the space of open access, including being part of the coalition that recently passed the first ever state-level open access policy in California. That makes publicly funded public health research available for free after only 1 year of publication. Meredith has also lobbied at the federal level for policies to make U.S. government-funded research more publicly available. And I know she's going to be sharing some developments with us on the private foundation side today as well. In 2014, Meredith was appointed to the Board of Directors for the Public Library of Science, also known as PLOS, P-L-O-S, an open access publisher most known for PLOS One, which is the world's largest science publication. Most recently, Meredith was awarded the Next Generation Leadership Award at the OpenCon conference in November of 2014, just last year, for her efforts to pass open access policies and promote early career researchers to publish open access. So we're very pleased to have her with us today for all of these efforts that she's had in this space. Meredith completed her PhD in ecology at the University of California at Davis. That's when she was a Switzer Fellow, and she was a member of the Center for Environmental Policy and Behavior. Her dissertation research focused on agricultural innovation for climate change adaptation and mitigation among Californian and New Zealand farmers. So welcome, Meredith. We are so pleased to have you here with us today on this topic, which we have actually never covered before as a foundation, but I know that we're going to be doing a lot more in this space in the future with your help. So thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for that really wonderful introduction. And I'm really excited to be here today and to be presenting on this topic. I think it's a great place to be talking with people about open access, particularly because I think, as I'll talk about in a minute, it really aligns with the Switzer Foundation's vision, and I think it's really exciting for the fellows. So I'll jump right in, and just so you all know, throughout the presentation, as I hit some natural stopping points, I may take a moment just to see if there's any clarifying questions, but I think we'll probably hold sort of the longer questions till the end. So just briefly to let you know what I'm going to discuss, I just want to mention briefly why I think open access is a really important issue for the Switzer Foundation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the current state of academic publishing and why open access is a really exciting initiative, what it is, and then how you can actually do it. And then I'll conclude by talking about some of the emerging trends with regards to open access policies and funding that I think are important for everybody to know who work in the scientific research arena. So just to start, why Switzer and open? And I pulled the Switzer Values off of the website to really highlight what I think is a potential for Switzer. And that's really, you know, it's a wonderful organization that believes in individuals and environmental stewardship and sustainability. It's also very interdisciplinary. And I think these last 2 points in particular, the idea about maximizing impact is really exciting. And I think it's a wonderful way in which we can think about how open access research can actually help Switzer achieve its goals and its values around maximizing impact. Making your work open can really provide an opportunity for all types of people to see your work and to really maximize the impact that the work that you do can have for broader society and community. So I'm really thrilled that they've decided this is an important and exciting topic. And I hope that they will consider some exciting new initiatives in this space in the future. So just to give a little bit of a background about my perspective on the current state of publishing. So the internet really created an opportunity to better share research. When the internet came about, we suddenly had the opportunity for scientists to be able to see articles online, to download them instantly, to have a much quicker and faster way to access scientific articles. And in many ways, this created an opportunity to better share research. But that hasn't necessarily happened throughout the academic publishing context. So probably a lot of you know Jorge Cham, who publishes PhD comics, and this is sort of a comic that he put together highlighting what the system kind of looks like, even though we've opened it up to the internet. So that scientists are working and contributing to the peer review process, and then we review things, but then the publishers often take this and bundle it together and then sell it back to us. And this is particularly troubling, I think, when it's taxpayer-funded research that we inevitably wind up paying for twice. So this is a bit of a joke, but it's actually quite true in a lot of contexts. So even though the internet has made publishing cheaper, journals have actually gotten more expensive over time. So this is data from the Association for Research Libraries, 1986 to 2011, showing the rate of increase of serial expenditures in particular as a result from 1986 data. So they've gone up about 400% in cost. So they've gotten more expensive even at a time when the internet has actually made publishing easier and in many ways cheaper because we don't have the same structure of typesetting and sending out physical copies of journals. And as a result of this, there have been a massive increase in profit margins among a lot of these traditional publishers. So here you can see, for example, this is from 2007 or 2008. Elsevier had a 31% profit margin, but actually that's gone up. Last year, I believe it was closer to 36 or 37%. So a lot of these traditional publishers have not necessarily changed a lot of the ways that they've operated, even though we've fundamentally changed the way that we share research, or we could share research with the internet. And this is all in the context of the fact that most of our scientific research globally as well as domestically is publicly funded. So we're putting money into science budgets, which we're continuing to fight long and hard for, to fund a lot of our research that's then being locked behind paywalls, that's not having the full potential impact that it could for both not only scientists but also for the broader community and the broader public. And so there's a disconnect between what we're funding as a federal government or globally that's through taxpayer money, but then not necessarily even available to those taxpayers to see once it's actually published. The interesting aspect of this, I think, is that a lot of these things are changing. So last year, Harvard actually came out and said that journals are so expensive, they're no longer going to be able to afford them. And I kind of joke a little bit about this, which I feel like I can since I'm at Harvard now. We're a pretty well-endowed institution, so there's probably a problem when the wealthiest institution in the world says that things are entirely too expensive. And in this article that was published in The Guardian, the director of Harvard Library was quoted as saying, "The system is absurd and it is inflicting terrible damage on libraries. We simply cannot go on paying the increase in subscription prices. In the long run, the answer will be open access journal publishing, but we need concerted effort to reach that goal." So there's a lot of movement happening at the academic level. There's also a lot of emerging press about this issue. So The Economist in particular has been featuring this topic in a number of publications recently, and not necessarily known for being the most liberal or left-leaning publication. They've really come out in support of open access, in particular open access that is when the research is funded by the taxpayer or by charities. So they published this article here on the left in 2012 highlighting why they think that it should be open if it's taxpayer funded. And they've more recently, last year, published an article talking about how changes in scientific discovery are happening more in an open access context. So that's happening within the general public, and there's also a lot of emerging advocacy efforts happening to try to change what the system looks like. This is a link to a screenshot of the open access button, which is a tool that you can actually download and to your desktop so that when you go to try to find a paper and you hit a paywall or your library doesn't have it, you can click the open access button and it will comb all of the potential open places that the article might be on the web and give you a copy of it. But if it's not available, then it gives you the opportunity to say why you needed the paper and how it's preventing you from doing your work or working within your community. And this was actually started by 2 undergraduate students in the UK who basically were trying to do research as undergraduate medical students and couldn't get access to a lot of the articles that they needed and kept having this problem. So there's a lot happening in this space, and just wanted to move forward and talk a little bit about what open access actually means, and then really try to give some resources to everybody on the call to understand how they can make their work more open and what kind of funding might be available for that. So open access is defined under the Berlin Declaration on Open Access, which was put out in 2003 as free immediate online access to scientific and scholarly articles with full reuse rights. So that is the most, I would say, I don't want to use the word extreme, but that's the most open definition. There are varying gradients of what open means, as I'll talk about when I get to some of the policies where the immediate access isn't necessarily there. There might be an embargo period, for example. But this was under the Berlin Declaration of 2003, and really the preface here, I think, highlights what I was trying to demonstrate earlier, which is that the Internet really has fundamentally changed the ways that we can distribute and share scientific knowledge. And with the Internet, we have an unprecedented and an exciting opportunity to make our work as publicly available as possible for the maximum benefit for society. So this is actually not a very old movement in that context, only about 11 years or so. So I wanted to highlight what I think are many different ways that you can make your work open, and they don't necessarily always involve paying lots of money or publishing in an open access journal. So I'm going to go through all of these individually and hopefully give you some resources that can help you understand what your options might be. So the first option on how you can make your work open is to actually publish in an open access journal. And this is a link to the Directory of Open Access Journals, which is a website where you can go and basically look up all of the different potential journals that are open access that you might be able to publish in. And as of yesterday, when I did a screenshot of this, there was a total of 10,288 journals in the repository. And those are also vetted for predatory open access journals. So it's not including predatory open access journals, which sometimes target people and try to get them to pay a lot of money to publish in a journal that actually winds up not being a quality journal. So this is a great resource for you to go and look up quality open access journals. And there's a lot of options there. It gives you a lot of different ways that you can look at searching by discipline or by title or something like that. The second option would be to publish in what are known as hybrid journals. So these are journals that maybe are a traditional journal, but now have created an open option. And typically you pay for that open option. So this is, for example, a screenshot of Taylor and Francis Publishers' Open Select option, where you can publish in a traditional journal that Taylor and Francis publishes, but you could pay extra in order to have your work become open access and then for people not to have to pay or hit paywalls to see it. Often this is a very expensive option. So for example, the Taylor and Francis articles are $2,950 for you to have that option. And I'll talk a little bit more about funding as I go on. But this is an option, but it often is quite pricey. Another option that's free, which is why I think it's really exciting, is to do what's known as self-archiving. So self-archiving can happen in a number of different ways. First, there are preprint servers. So this is essentially where before you would submit your article for review or before it was officially accepted in its final version, you could upload a version of that article in its final form to various preprint servers that exist out there. So in our field, the bioarchives is a preprint server for biology. Archives.org is the one for physics that's been around for a very long time and is widely used in the physics community. And Figshare is an emerging one that I think is really exciting that allows you to upload presentations and documents and preprints as well. And then there are also institutional repositories where you could archive a copy of your paper. So this could be at your own institution. So for example, Harvard has a repository called Dash, where faculty actually, because they have an open access policy, are required to put their papers in this repository as a contingent on being a faculty member. But there are other ones as well. One of the most widely known ones, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, is known as Pubmed, and this is the institutional repository for the National Institutes of Health. And they have a requirement that if you receive funding from them, you have to put your article in these repositories as well. And one thing that I think is really exciting is that actually the majority of publishers allow for this self-archiving, either preprint or postprint. So overall, as of I think 2 days ago when I looked, 76% of all publishers on the list here, which included 1,812 publishers, not just journals, but publishers, allow some form of self-archiving. So that means that overall, the majority of times, you're probably able to either upload a preprint or a postprint version of a paper that you've submitted so that it would be available for people to see. And this is an exciting resource, Sherpa Romeo, that helps you understand through these different colors what types of journals allow what kinds of options. And so here's a screenshot of what that looks like. So I pulled up 2 journals that people in our field might be particularly interested in. The first you can see is Global Environmental Change, and the second one is Ecology. So Global Environmental Change allows you to archive a preprint as well as a postprint, the final draft essentially after it's formally accepted onto your own website or onto any of these other servers. It doesn't let you archive the publisher's version of the PDF, but Ecology actually does. So you can use this resource to look up by journal what your actual options are for being open and self-archiving your work. So I wanted to mention funding because one of the things that I hear that's really that's really overwhelming to a lot of people is the cost. So a lot of people assume that it's really expensive to publish open, in particular because of these hybrid options I mentioned earlier where it might cost $3,000. But actually many open access journals are free. So within the directory of open access journals, you can actually filter out and look for journals in particular that don't have any article processing charges. And I found 6,400 of those out of about the 10,000 in the repository. So 64% of the ones in that actual database are free. You wouldn't actually have to pay in order to publish in them. There's also fee waivers for a lot of these journals. So since I serve on the board of directors for PLOS, I can tell you PLOS has a really exciting and open fee waiver. And essentially, to publish in PLOS, it's PLOS 1, it's $1,350. So it's substantially cheaper than the hybrid option, but you know that can still be a lot of money, particularly for early career researchers or graduate students. But they do have a fee assistance program. So if you say I can't afford it, no questions asked. You basically get a fee waiver and don't have to pay for it. And this is pretty common. I don't think that there's any stigma that should be associated with asking for this. So 83% of people who published in open access journals asked for this publication fee assistance between 2009 and 2011. So the majority of people aren't actually paying for a lot of this stuff themselves. There's also a variety of scholarship funds available that I'll also mention in the next slide. So for example, certain institutions have open access scholarship funds where you could apply for funding through your institution and they would help cover the cost to publish in an open access journal. And there's also the option, many grants allow for you to write article processing charges to make your work open into your grants when you submit grants. So that's another way that you could think about funding open research. I wanted to share this resource with you. This is from PLOS. I've listed the website there. And essentially what it allows you to do is go in and look by your own institution, within your own state, within your own country, or by the funder that you have your funding from, whether or not there are opportunities for you to receive scholarships or assistance to publish your work open. So it's a really comprehensive database where you can actually try to understand, can I receive funding from either my school or my funder or even other places that would help me publish my work open without having to front the cost myself. Wanted to pause briefly to see if there was any clarifying questions. Doesn't seem like
so far we have not. Yeah, so far we haven't had any. If anyone has a clarifying question, feel free to type it into chat or ask it now. We'll do a complete Q&A as soon as Meredith is finished with her presentation.
Okay, I'm assuming I'll just keep going.
Yep.
I wanted to mention some of the benefits of open access, both personally as well as for broader society. So personally, for example, one of the things that I think is really exciting about publishing in an open access journal is a lot of them do network measures that are pretty exciting to see. So for example, in PLOS, it'll tell you how many people have viewed your article, how many people have shared it, who's coming to the article, and then how they're sharing it and how many people are doing that. So it helps you understand the broader impact, the broader network impact of your work. There also is a website called Open Access Success Stories, and these are really exciting because they talk about how people outside of academia and particularly are benefiting from their work from open access. So how patients are better able to understand conditions, medical conditions that they have, how K through 12 teachers have better access to articles and can use science in their classrooms because of open access, for example. So there's a lot of broader impacts within the community from making your work open. And even within the realm of public good, there is a huge issue around making work open, particularly for humanitarian and ethical reasons. So PLOS last year pulled together open access articles on the Ebola virus because of the outbreak of Ebola, with the idea that, in particular, people in developing countries don't have the funding often to read these articles or pay for these processing charges, and their libraries don't have the budgets to actually purchase the journals. And so, therefore, we should make this work open, particularly in light of endemic diseases like HIV/AIDS or Ebola in times of crises. And for the own personal benefit of the scientists on the call, there's actually several articles that have been published about the citation advantage of open access articles. So if you're interested in making your work open, but you want to be conscious and careful about what the implications of that might mean for your academic career, for example, there is actually a lot of research suggesting that open access articles are more frequently cited because they are more frequently seen. And so you might have a citation bump within your own work if you were starting to make it more open, either through self-archiving or repositories, or making it open access in the publishing context. So I wanted to mention a few of the trends that I'm seeing in policies, just so you sort of have a sense of where things are going, and then I'll be happy to take questions, and I've got supplementary slides if we need to look at those as well. But the reality is that it's a growing trend for research organizations, funders, and all kinds of organizations to create policies around open access. So here you can see between 2005 all the way up to what will be implemented in 2016, the growing number of research organizations and funders that are requiring in some capacity that work that is funded through them is made open. So this is definitely a growing trend. And it's happening at multiple levels. So one of the first contexts in which this happened in the U.S. was at the National Institutes of Health, which I already mentioned, their open access repository, Pubmed Central. And so the NIH policy has been in place actually since 2006. And their policy is that if you receive any funding whatsoever of any amount from the National Institutes of Health, and you publish an article that was funded by that within 12 months of publishing that article, you have to put a copy of it into Pubmed Central. And this is actually now law. So I've listed the law there that states this policy. And this was really the paving force for a lot of other policies within the U.S. context. So after this policy was implemented, and basically over the first 5 years of its implementation was able to demonstrate that it didn't have an adverse effect on businesses or publishers, for example, that most of the visitors going there every day, 1 million unique visitors every day going to Pubmed Central, the vast majority of them were from the general public or industry, not from academia. So it was people who were literally going to understand more about particular diseases. And the White House decided that this was a good strategy for all federally funded research. And so in 2013, they put out a directive issued at federal agencies that fund more than $100 million in research a year to develop a policy similar to the one at NIH, more or less. And so these are rolling out. The Department of Energy one, for example, is now out and has been available for public comment. But basically, this is coming down the pipeline. So if you have federal funding, it will be likely that within the next 5 years, you will, if you're continuing to receive funding from them, that you will be having to put your articles into a public repository. But a lot of this is still happening. And there's also been efforts over the last several years at a federal level for bipartisan legislation. And this would, instead of just being a White House directive, which could be overturned by an incoming president, this would actually make this law policy at a legal congressional level. And that's been bipartisan, so it's been supported mostly by Senator Cornyn on the Republican side and then a number of Democrats as well. So it's very bipartisan. And then, as Lauren mentioned, there's also now a push for state-level policies. So in September 2014, Governor Brown signed AB 609, which was a policy I was working on, which made California the first state to require that state-funded research around public health be made publicly available in a repository, similar to the NIH policy as well. And there are other states that are trending in this direction as well. And there's also been a lot happening at the funder level, so private foundations and other funders are moving in this direction. Probably the most exciting and ground-shaking thing that happened in this space was the Gates Foundation announcing the world's strongest policy on open access in November 2014. And their policy actually, when it's implemented in its full, which won't happen until 2017, actually would require that articles be made freely and publicly available immediately upon publication. So there is a 12-month delay that is going to be allowed for the first 2 years of the policy, similar to the NIH policy. But starting in 2017, if you get money from the Gates Foundation, you have to make your work publicly available immediately upon publication. The Ford Foundation just announced a month ago, similarly, that they are expanding Creative Commons, which is the open access license for all of their grant-funded projects as well. So there's a lot happening in the private space as well as the public space for open access. And so I just wanted to end by highlighting, there are a lot of ways to make your work open, whether it's through self-archiving, hybrid journals, open access journals. You can also think about encouraging, if you're at an institution or you're affiliated with a funder, encouraging them to create these policies to maximize the benefit of their research money. And there's a lot of policy efforts happening as well. And I've listed my email there as well as my Twitter, and I tweet a lot about this issue, so if you're interested to learn more, you can follow me on Twitter. So thanks to the Switzer Foundation for having me do this, and I'm really excited to take questions. Thank you.
That was super, Meredith, and we already have some questions. So I'm actually going to turn it over first to Josh Franco. Let me unmute you, Josh. Josh actually has 2 questions, so we'll take them one at a time, but let's not skip off of him until he gets to ask both. Josh, your mic is live.
Oh, hi, Meredith. Thanks for the presentation. My first question is, what is the impact on research of open access? So what's the impact of open access on research? So, for example, how does open access change the pace of research, the pursuit of research to obtain tenure, and then the speed at which scientific discoveries are made?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, there's a number of things that have been done in this space. PLOS has actually looked at this. And, you can imagine that essentially, if you're making things publicly available immediately and more people are able to see it, that it can actually speed the innovation process. And I would think about that in multiple ways, so not just within an academic context where if I'm able to read your paper freely and immediately without having to go through my library, or if my library doesn't have those publications, for example, that might make me, use your paper in my own work and spur my own thinking. But I think this effect is actually even potentially greater within the small business community. So within that open access stories website that I mentioned, you can actually look by the type of person or group that's benefited. And there's a lot of small business and tech startups that are listed there that talk about how, because they had access to open articles, they were able to spur innovation within their small business community. And you can imagine the economic benefits that can bring to, a community from tech startups and things like that as well. So I definitely think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it can spur the scientific process.
Great.
And Josh, would you like to go ahead and ask your second question?
Yeah. My second question is about what disciplines are ahead of the curve in open access, and which ones are behind the curve, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I would highlight the physics community as well as the biomedical community as tending to be pretty ahead of the curve in terms of the way they share their work. So Archives that I mentioned earlier is the physics preprint server that has basically been completely normalized within the community, where if you're in physics, it's very common that you would put your article up there for public comment and sharing even before you would submit it for publication. And that does multiple things. One, it potentially creates a better paper if you're getting comments on it and feedback early on. But two, people are archiving all of their articles, so you're not relying on library subscriptions or costs to have to get the articles. So the physics community has been really up in front on this for a long time. Biomedical, I think, is also in part because of the repositories, but also because of the clear benefits to patients to better understand their conditions, their family's conditions. I can tell you personally, I had a family member who was diagnosed with a very rare brain disease, and my family was able to benefit personally from being able to use the Pubmed database to look at, to find articles about it and better understand the condition. So I think that community as well has been in front. Where there's been some challenges, or where I think there have been slower implementation, is within the humanities in particular. For history, for example, or for other humanities where the publishing isn't quite the same as it might be in the scientific context, where your thesis might be embargoed for many years because it doesn't have the same protections, or the humanities community in general, I would say, has not been as quick to embrace this concept as some of the other communities. However, that is changing. There is an organization that just started in Europe purely focused on the humanities and trying to highlight the benefits in the humanities and the arts for making research open as well.
Super. So the next questions that we have are from Chris Stave. But before we move on, Josh, I just wanted to ask if you would unmute yourself really quickly and just tell us where you work. I realized I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I'm a graduate student at UC Merced.
Super.
Yeah, and Meredith, we've talked several
times.
Hi, Josh. Yeah, when I saw the posting on the website, I was like, Meredith. I'm like, that name sounds so familiar. So I'm really glad that we bumped into each other on a webinar.
So the background story for everyone else on the call is that Josh used to work in Congress, and I used to lobby him sometimes on this issue. So I'm really glad that he's on the call.
I am too. Welcome, Josh. We actually have a quick story that we'll tell in a minute and get Meredith to talk a little bit, because we had some run-ins with Hill people this weekend, actually, at our fellows retreat. We want to talk about open access in that context, too. But before we do that, I'd like to go ahead and call on Chris Stave. She has some questions for you as well. Chris, your mic is open.
Thank you. Thanks, Meredith. This is a really interesting topic. I've kind of been thinking about it just in a very loose way, so this sort of helps solidify a lot of those ideas. So I have two questions. One is just a question of clarification. This requirement from funders like NIH to put the publications up, how does that work with journals that say you can't post your articles? Do they have some kind of an agreement, or are the versions that get posted on PubMed, are those what you were saying, the preprint versions?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Really great and important question. The reality is that most of the publishers now essentially have caveats for all of these funder policies, which is why I think they're so great, because essentially it's creating a situation where taxpayer-funded research or privately funded research, essentially the publishers, that they make an exception. So, and that's it's especially true of laws like the NIH policy. I mean, the NIH policy is a law that is required. So private for-profit companies can't usurp a law. So that's why they actually have these, they basically allow it to happen. But, the reality is also when you start to have major foundations like the Gates Foundation step up and say, all of the work that we fund has to be open, there's a lot of high-quality work coming out of the Gates Foundation funding, and journals are going to want to continue to publish high-quality work. So essentially, the way it works now is that you get a caveat, and if you have a requirement within your institution or within your funder that you have to make your work open and put it in these repositories, the journals let you do it.
Okay. Because I think about this like with the whole ResearchGate thing, which I'm didn't really sign up for, but then all of a sudden I keep getting these notes saying, we found one of your publications and we're putting it up there, and it makes me wonder, if there's, some law that says if somebody copies my publication and puts it on one of these sites, do I have any, is there any sort of legal problem with that? That's a different question than the Pubmed one, but I don't know, maybe you can address that later too.
Well, I think the thing there would be very journal specific, and that's where you could really use the Sherpa Romeo source that I highlighted, and it's really fantastic because it tells you what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. I mean, that being said, I don't know of too many instances in which publishers have gone after specific academics and asked them to take down publications they've put on the web, but I would use the Sherpa Romeo as a resource to really make sure that if you're worried about those kinds of issues and you want to be within the realm of the law, that you take care to look at the specific publications. And like I said, 76% of them allow some kind of self-archiving. So in general, you're probably okay.
Great. So my other question is actually a bigger question, and I'm sure you've gotten asked with this, but is how do we deal with the quality issue? And of course there are questions, so I have my colleagues who are reviewing my promotion application saying, these are open access journals, they're garbage, and they discount them immediately because of the perception that open access means low quality. And that I can see changing over time. But just in general, that there's also the issue of, how do we then raise the bar for open access publications? Yes, all sides of it. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm sure you can.
Oh, I think this is a really, I am myself about to hopefully start a tenure track position, and of course I think about this stuff. And there's actually a really amazing early career researcher who's I borrowed this slide from, and I've cited her at the bottom so you guys could look her up. Named Erin McKiernan, and she's a postdoctorate right now, and she's talked a lot about being open as an early career researcher and what it really means or doesn't mean, and how you can still be open and still have maximum impact. But there's a couple of things I'll mention in this space. The first is Dora, the Declaration on Research Assessment. This is came out, I think, last year, 2 years ago, and it's basically this idea that, we need to fundamentally rethink the way that we evaluate people in academia, and that we shouldn't necessarily be only looking at things like impact factors on journals as a measure of quality, when in reality the content of the paper is really important and should be considered, not necessarily where it was published all of the time. So you could sign this as an individual. I actually signed it because I think it's really important. But I also think this idea that, oh no, to go all the way through my presentation again, sorry. But there are a lot of open journals that have high impact factors. So if that is important and you want to think about that, I have a slide this slide kind of highlights that. So a lot of OA journals are actually really high quality journals. So for example, a lot of the PLOS journals have a pretty high impact factor. Nature Communications, which is now entirely open access, scientific reports. There's a lot in the space of biology, environmental science that we could be publishing in that are open, that are still really high impact factor. And I guess the other thing I would just highlight in this space, too, is the citation bump aspect. So actually, the counter to it is, well, if my work is open, it's actually being seen more and it's being cited more. And I think we have to, as academics, I think we have to also be careful to highlight the importance of making work open for people outside of academia. So the idea that, okay, yes, for tenure we have to publish and all these things. There are options to publish in high-quality journals, but also that really we should be thinking about the broader impact our work can have on society. And I totally recognize that is often a pipe dream, but I think it's important to have those conversations. And Erin, this woman I mentioned, she actually talks about how one of her publications, which she published in PeerJ, which is actually an emerging, growing open access journal, but they don't actually have an impact factor on purpose, and it completely dropped out of her qualifications. So like it wasn't even part of her CV because it didn't have an impact factor. So it is a reality. I'm not going to say it's not, but I think within the space there's a lot of ways to have the conversation, to talk about your broader impact and to talk about your, the citations you might get. And furthermore, there are options to publish in high impact factor journals that are open.
Great. Super. Thanks for the great questions, Chris. So next up we have Robert, and he's actually one of the call-in users. Robert Long is. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I move on, Chris, can you tell us, too, where you're from? I actually Googled you in the meantime, so I know you're in Las Vegas at University of Nevada, but would you tell everyone?
Sure. Yes, I'm at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, in the School of Environmental and Public Affairs. And I just wanted to add one other thing. I just spent a year as a Fulbright scholar in Ethiopia. And one of the things that I came away with from that experience is a desire to publish more open access, because the researchers I was working with have no access to either paper journals or subscriptions because there's no money. And I think that's the case for a lot of developing countries. And they're great researchers there, but they are so hampered because they don't have access to good work. And so I think this idea and the work you're doing, Meredith, to push this is great.
Well, thank you. And I totally agree with you. In the early career researcher community, we had a conference called OpenCon in 2014, and we brought a number of emerging researchers from the developing world. And actually, a lot of them are pushing in their own countries for open access policies with a lot of success. So they're happening all over Africa, Asia, in part because they, like you said, they literally don't have any access. And particularly when we think about trying to do science for the public good, these are a lot of the places that really, truly need access.
Super. So I'm going to go ahead and move over to Robert Long, who's also one of our Switzer Fellows. And he's either call-in user 3 or call-in user 4. So for those of you calling in on landlines or mobile phones, I'm actually going to unmute two of you and try and figure out which one of you is Robert. So whoever else is the other call-in user, just a warning, will probably be able to hear you. Okay, both call-in users are muted, or unmuted, excuse me. Robert, which one are you?
I'm talking right now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and now I know that you're calling user 3. Okay, go ahead.
Well, thanks so much, Meredith. A lot of great information. I'm actually a wildlife biologist at Woodland Park Zoo. I do field research out of the zoo here. And I am just curious. I didn't catch it, and I had to step away for a minute, so it might have been that moment. But do most of these open resource journals have full editorial processes where they send papers out to experts? I kind of assume they do since they're peer-reviewed. And the other thing I just wanted to kind of bring up was it seems to me that there's a pretty close tie, or there historically has been, between professional societies and the journals they produce. And I'm just thinking of the ESA journals, the Journal of Wildlife Management, things like that. I'm wondering if there is pushback from some of those societies because they obviously probably still make some money from the print journals, or even from the electronic versions of the journals that go through the publishers. And I'm not sure how all that works, but I'm wondering, is there pushback, or are the professional societies generally supportive because they really want to get information out also?
Yeah, two really good questions. So I have some supplementary slides here that I've pulled up. These are all coming from MIT, from their library, and I've listed the website below so you can go and look at it. But so kind of to your first question, is it true that open access articles aren't peer-reviewed or don't have the same kind of processes? No. So all of these, and that's why I really recommend the directory of open access journals, because they do vet for those kind of predatory open access journals that have unfortunately given open access a bad name in a lot of ways. But, I mean, these are all peer-reviewed processes with the same kinds of editorial boards. I mean, I can tell you, for example, for PLOS that I'm affiliated with, I mean, this is the world's largest science publication, and so you can just imagine how complex the network of academic editors and people are, and they're very well respected in their field. So, so it's definitely not true that open access articles or journals are, you know, not peer reviewed or don't have good quality editorial processes. For the most part, they do. And then to your second question, I think this is also one of the myths. Yeah, here we go. Is it true that open access articles will inevitably harm scholarly societies? So here's kind of the response from MIT, as well as some links that you could go to for some more information. They argue no, and I would agree with that. That doesn't mean, however, that there isn't pushback from a lot of these societies, particularly the really small ones that do actually have a lot of income from their journals. So, you know, the open access is not necessarily making everything free. I mean, it's shifting the burden of the cost in different ways, right? So rather than paying for the subscription, you pay for the article up front and then it's open. So it's a matter of shifting money around in a lot of ways. And there are academic societies that have done this. So the American Society for Cell Biology, for example, is one of these scholarly societies that became open access many, many years ago, I think back in the 80s. So they were really on the cutting edge of this. And they've demonstrated that that's a viable business model. It's change. You know, it is a process. It is a change. But hopefully, you know, this slide here might help give you a little more information about what that might look like.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Ask, are there any other questions out there? Josh has got one. Josh, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it out loud.
In hearing Chris's her story and her experiences, a question that came to mind is, how do universities compare with regard to open access and tenure practices? So the idea is, like, I would imagine early career scholars are making choices about, you know, do they want to publish in open access or not? And I mean, for me, I would want to know which universities where I'm applying to would be open to that type of focus or that type of work.
Yeah, that's a really exciting question for me to field, actually, because this is a point that in some of my talks I've been giving lately is to turn this around onto early career researchers in particular, and to ask these kinds of questions in your interviews. So I was on the job market this year, and actually in several of my on-campus interviews, I asked the deans and the department chairs, is there funding available for open access publications through your library? How is open access valued within your school? How would it be considered in the tenure process? And I talked in my cover letters about my efforts to make my work open and why I think that's important as a researcher and a scientist. And in particular, I was applying mostly at land-grant institutions. So I think it's really in line with the values that the land-grant institutions have for having a positive impact on society. But I think this is a great opportunity, rather than sort of having it the other way around, where we sort of say, oh my gosh, we have to publish in Nature and Science to have these high impacts to get tenure. I think there is an opportunity for all researchers at all levels to ask questions about open access in the other way around. And I actually had very positive feedback about me bringing that up in some of my interviews and my meetings, because people thought that it demonstrated I cared about my broader impact. So I've done that and actually had it positively well received. But I also think it depends on the school, and not having gone through the tenure process myself, I can't entirely comment on the way in which they're valued, but I've heard that in most cases, tenure process is largely by the by the journals that you've published in, and that impact factor is still an important component of that, unfortunately. But I think that can change when we start to ask these kinds of questions.
Meredith, this is Lauren. I have a question for you. So we have another caller here, Andrea Adams, who is at our retreat this weekend. And we did for those of you who are not Switzer Fellows, we did a spring retreat for all of our 2014 fellows in Washington, D.C. with a focus on how to talk to policymakers about your science. And during the panel discussion, when there were several Hill legislative staff folks talking with the fellows, they were saying that they don't really have access, which is not surprising. Their offices don't pay for access to the journals. And so the question came up from the room of, well, then what about using open access, which was a great lead-in to our webinar this week. What about using open access journals? And then the response from the panel was sort of, oh, well, that's not peer-reviewed, and we could never go there. And while we've already talked about that on the webinar, it did raise a question for me. I'm curious, sort of, how do you spread the word? What's the most effective way at this point to spread the word among, not just academics and scientists, but among people who might use this research and might get access to the open access journals, but might not even have a sense or any sense of that's possible at this point? Yeah. How do you spread the word among those groups?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Lauren. I mean, it was actually a great way for me to do lobbying because inevitably I'd be meeting with the legislative assistant, and it was a great lead-in because I could be like, I bet you remember when you left college and you suddenly lost your library subscription and you couldn't get access to articles anymore, and they're like, oh my gosh, yes, totally. So they've personally experienced it. I find it terrifying to think that our policymakers can't even get access to scientific articles while making policy. But I think I'm hopeful that, especially with the White House directive, that this will have a massive change because once we've got all of our federal agencies requiring that articles be made publicly available in a repository 1 year after publication or even less potentially, I think that will create a massive impact because of the amount of research that we fund here in the U.S., for example. But this is why I feel so strongly about working on this issue at a federal policy level, because I think we do need a policy for this. But, yeah, in terms of making people aware of these options, I think it has to start with events like that you guys did. The fact that, current fellows in Congress don't even realize that open access journals are peer-reviewed and of high quality is concerning. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, I do think because of a few bad actors in terms of predatory open access journals, that's given a bad reputation to a very large movement that is not in that context at all. But this is why I feel very strongly about federal level policies, because I think once those policies pass and once those implementation plans are put in place, there'll be so much more information available that when you Google it, you'll get an article. It'll come up on Google, and it won't be hidden behind a paywall. So that's why I think pushing for those to come out is really important.
Super. Thanks for the answer to that. Are there any other questions from folks on the call? Oh, I see one. Chris has one. Chris, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it?
There you go. Sure. I had to turn my little heater off because it was too noisy. Okay, so my other question has to do with this idea about sort of immediate access. You mentioned that, like, the Gates Foundation is pushing to have articles available immediately and no 12-month embargo, et cetera. And that, I think, is a great idea, but I was also a little concerned about the idea that data would have to be made available immediately. Having done research studies where you collect a lot of data and then you get drawn off on other things, and it may actually take some time before the data is all collected and even analyzed before you get it out. And so it would concern me to put my data out before I've had a chance to write about it. So I don't, maybe this is just a clarification that I'm not quite understanding what the requirement to make the data available immediately, what would that actually mean?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I am not as familiar. I'd be really happy to follow up with you offline to help answer your question because I know the right person to ask this question to. So there is also a whole open data movement as well. And so, for example, certain open access publishers have moved in that direction, that you also have to make your data open when you publish with them. I don't work as much on the open data side as I do on the article side, because I think the open data is a little bit more for within the scientific community, and my real passion in this issue lies for the benefits for people outside of academia that might benefit from our work. But there are definitely open data policies that are out there, and in some ways, I think that your concern, it could be valid in the sense that, for example, I think it's the CGIR, which is the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. I actually have a project with them. They make all of their data publicly available, and they do that oftentimes before their own researchers have even had a chance to publish articles, which means it's open for other people to mine. But I think the flip side of that is it's publicly funded process, the data is out there, and other people can hopefully do quality work with it as well. But I can certainly understand your concern if it's, you yourself have done all this work and not even had a chance to publish it yourself. So I'd be happy to follow up with you. If you want to shoot me an email, I'll put my email back up, and I can try to get an answer to your question for you from someone who's an expert on data in particular.
So just maybe a more general question. It sounds like these conversations are taking place in lots of different places. So I imagine there are other people asking the same kinds of questions. Are there ways to have input into these discussions, or?
Absolutely, particularly at the federal level right now. So because there's only two federal research agencies that have actually already even released their proposed policies to comply with the White House directive, but they're all going through a public comment period. So that means they're all publicly available and are open for comment from the public. So as those continue to roll out, if you have some in particular that you would feel very passionately about, say, for example, the National Science Foundation or the EPA, you would actually have a chance to engage publicly in that process. And one of the organizations that does a lot of communication around these issues and puts out press releases is a group, is the Association for Research Libraries, and they're based in DC, and they also have a group affiliated with them called SPARC, which is the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Research Coalition, so SPARC, and they're following these issues really carefully, and they are always putting out press releases and things when the public comment periods are coming up.
Great.
Super. I think Joseph had a few comments about the open data question. Joseph, go ahead and unmute yourself. But in the meantime, while you're doing that, I did just want to mention to everyone we're a little bit over time now, so we understand if you allotted in your scheduled time from 12:30 to 1:30 Eastern and you have to run. We totally understand and we appreciate you coming. I do want to also say thank you so much to Meredith for this webinar. We're going to keep the line open, so Joseph, you'll have a chance to add your comments and anyone else who has questions. But I did just want to give permission for anyone who has to go ahead and go, and to say thanks to Meredith again for this great, great webinar. We will be posting the video of this on our website today, hopefully. So I'll be sending you all a survey link with questions just so we can get your feedback about the webinar, and also a link to the webinar recording. So if you'd like to forward this to colleagues or groups that you're part of, we would certainly welcome that. I think that this webinar should go far and wide in terms of viewership. So Joseph, please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, regarding the question about having to release data before you've analyzed it. It's a really good question, and something which is concerning a lot of people. And at the moment, the policy around it is really, I would describe it as kind of early days. Lots of different funders have lots of different policies and takes on what open data is and exactly what it means to have provided your data. Some people, say that if you stick up an Excel sheet, that's kind of enough. Others say that it needs to be much more kind of sophisticated than that. But around the concern of releasing data before you've had a chance to analyze it. The way I understand things at the moment, and I will qualify this by saying I'm not an expert, but I do know one or two things around this, is that basically the idea is that you release the data that is needed to validate your conclusion. So the data you've analyzed already to put into your paper, you would be required to release, but no more. So that's the general idea there, as I understand it.
Great, thanks, Joseph. I should probably get a little more up to speed on open data myself. Any other questions?
I'm sorry about that, Meredith. I stepped away for a minute. This is Lauren. Are there any other questions? Hearing none. We've got several people who texted in to say thank you so much for the webinar, folks who did have to log off right at 1:30. But Meredith, I just want to thank you again. This is really excellent. And I'll be sending out the link to everyone with the live post on our website with the webinar recording and also with a survey so that you have some feedback about the event today. Great. So thanks again. Everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you.